We're going to shift gears now and go into something that builds on the conversations of today, but really takes us in a different time dimension. We're going to look into the future, not just with regards to threats and risks, business risk, government risk, and risk mitigation, but really look into some other future trends that I think have significant impact with regards to national governments, public policy making, and where we need to go with business models. It's something that often I don't hear about, I don't see in conferences and venues. Typically, we're looking in the rearview mirror as opposed to looking out into the future. So we're gonna go ahead and build on that. And when I think about the conversation today, a lot of it has revolved around what I would call threats, technology, and this concept of trust. When you think about the last panel and some of the panels from this morning, really we have some choices to make, right? And my sense here is that we're going to find a way to embrace technology, we're going to deal with threats, and we're going to have to figure out how to shape our environment. And on the latter point, we have choices to make. We can, and I really try to drive this to 3 C's. We're either going to cooperate, we're going to compete, or we're going to be in a situation of conflict. And we as nations, representing nations, businesses, and other actors, we just need to figure that out. So from a technology perspective, and that's going to be the initial focus of the discussion this afternoon, is science and applied technology. I think we've struggled a bit with predicting the future. Just going back, I pulled a Goldman Sachs investment research report and some things from the Electronic Privacy Company, Electronic Privacy Foundation, to kind of think about what we knew and what we didn't know. And looking back over the last 10 years, who would have thought that the cost of bandwidth would have declined by a factor of nearly 40x? Who would have thought that the processing costs that we currently have would have declined by nearly 60x? We talked today about smartphones and what they have become in terms of that device, that gateway into the future and into what we do with our home, what we do with our cars, and what have you. Who would have thought that 90% of the data in the world today has been created in just the past 2 years, and that predictions are that forecasts show us that we think it would double every 2 years through the year 2020. The ubiquitous nature of wireless, now really the ubiquitous nature of what we're seeing in commercial cryptography, these are all trends that I think we struggled with predicting and are grasping with now. So to help us look into a future which is accelerating even faster in science and technology innovation, we have an expert. We have Dan Geer. Many of you know Dan, Chief Information Security Officer over at Inquitel. Dan's going to come up and speak for about 25 minutes or so and take us on a journey into what I would say what could be in the area of cybersecurity. And then we're privileged to have Gilman Louie, President, CEO of Inquitel, coming from his previous life and what he's doing today to help us kind of envision what that means in the world of business for cybersecurity companies. What does it mean for critical infrastructure companies? What are some of the implications as we talk about global interconnected corporations? What does it mean for global multinationals? And then the 3 of us will have a conversation that kind of interplays between science and technology, those trends that Dan talks about, the business ramifications, and then we'll bring in the conversation around to public sector, and specifically national governments and public policy making. At the end, and we'll wrap it up, we'll have about 10 minutes, I think, left for doing Q&A. So as your mind starts to move into the future, hold your questions, please, until the end. We'll get to them in the last 10 or 15 minutes or so. So to kick us off on science and technology, looking into the future, Dan Geer.
Thank you. The actual transcript of this will be made available to the organizers. So, sort of sounding like Jay Leno, steal all you like, we'll make more. As you know, predicting the future is difficult. It's exceptionally difficult. With that caveat, nevertheless, that's exactly what I'm going to do. Let me start with the beginning, and that is that science tends to take us places where policy does not come along easily. Policy tends to take us places where science does not come along easily. And I want to say that neither one can be unmindful of the other, that they are in fact conjoined, and any implication that they are not just generally founders in due course. I'm going to confine myself to just 6 points where I see science, including applied science, asking us to look ahead. It is necessarily short. There is a longer treatment that is referenced in the notes. The 6 of them are identity, ownership as perimeter, the diffusion of control, communications provenance, uniqueness, and opaqueness, which I hope I'll make clear as I go along. The first is identity. Prediction. Miniaturization will continue its long-running progression, and in consequence, devices will continue to proliferate into spaces into which they were never before present. Burgeoning proliferation demands device autonomy, and it will get it. For autonomy to not itself be a source of irredeemable failure modes, devices will have individual identities and some degree of decision-making capacity. As device counts grow, device identity eclipses human user identity, because user identity can be derived from device identity insofar as the proliferation of devices means that users are each and severally surrounded by multiple devices, devices whose identity is baked into their individual hardware, as is already the case in mobile telephony. There is then neither need nor process to assert, "My name is Dan," as Dan's several devices will collectively confirm that this is Dan, perhaps in consultation with each other. Per Shoshana Zuboff's laws, all devices are therefore sensors, and as the devices themselves have immutable device identities, Dan's claim to being Dan is decided algorithmically and distally. Cryptographic keys for users thus become irrelevant, as devices will have them, thereby freeing users from key management, much less password drills. The Fifth Amendment is entirely mooted, as courts have already ruled that only something you know is protected thereunder, not something you are or something you have. That is to say that production of devices under subpoena cannot be thwarted. The long-standing debate over whether identity should be name-centric, that is to say where Dan is an identity and some key is an attribute of Dan, or key-centric, that is to say where the key is the identity and Dan is an attribute of the key, is thus decided in favor of key-centricity, though the keys are now held in a fog of small devices. This setting mimics how a stratum of elite people carry neither identification nor money. In the context of their retinue, there is no need for either. For the result of this data fusion to not be a unitary identity for the individual user, policy will have to demarcate data fusion with a vigor that it has never before dared. Second point, ownership as perimeter. The paradigm of cybersecurity has long been perimeter control, but that same proliferation of devices rewrites the calculus of what is a perimeter. It is clear that the design of the internet as we now know it rests on 2 principles above all others: preferential attachment and the end-to-end communication protection. Preferential attachment yields scale-free network growth that in turn maximizes network resistance to random faults. Internet build-out could not have happened otherwise. The end-to-end principle is and has been the fuel for innovation, as end-to-end scales, whereas permission-seeking does not. Both of those principles are now under stress. First, the S-curve of internet growth, that is to say addressable internet growth, passed its inflection point in November of 2008, and since that time, growth rates have slowed. Second, random faults no longer comprise the availability risk they once did, all the while the carriers and governments alike clearly want non-preferential attachment. Carriers in their desire for economic hegemony, free world governments in their desire for attribution, and unfree world governments in their desire to manipulate information flow. Add in the proliferation of small devices, and the paradigm of cybersecurity can no longer be perimeter control. To take but one example, Let's count cores in the Qualcomm Snapdragon 801. The central CPU is 4 cores. The Adreno 330 GPU is another 4. Video out is 1 more. The Hexacon QDSP is 3. The modem is 2 and most likely 4. Bluetooth is another one, as is the USB controller and the GPS. The Wi-Fi is at least 1 and most likely 2, and none of that includes charging, power, or display. That makes somewhere between 18 and 21 cores. In the vocabulary of the Internet of Things, I ask you whether that is one thing or the better part of 24 things. It is pretty certain that each of those cores can reach the others. So is the perimeter to be defended the physical artifact in the user's pocket, or is it the execution space of each of those cores separately? I looked at 7 different estimates of the growth of the Internet of Things as a market phenomenon, and everything from smart electric meters to networked light bulbs to luxury automobiles, and the median is a compound annual growth rate of 35%. If perimeter control is to remain the paradigm of cybersecurity, then the number of perimeters to defend in the Internet of Things is doubling every 17 months. So what is to be the perimeter of control from a cybersecurity point of view? Is it ownership that demarcates perimeter? More and more of user capabilities controlled by licensure, not ownership in the dictionary sense of the word ownership. The science is taking us away from ownership conferring cradle-to-grave control towards a spectrum of temporally constrained permission granting. I can give you my bed, but I cannot give you my iTunes. Self-driving cars are as good an illustration as any. Over-the-air auto-update of firmware will not be optional in either time nor place, and vehicle-to-vehicle communication will do route selection in the name of the common good. In a digital world, nothing comes without strings attached. Number 3, control diffusion. As has been shown in finance, if one entity can do high-speed trading, then all must or die. But whereas predatory and/or unstable trading is subject to a quantum of regulatory control, cyber predation is not, and cyber predators have zero legacy drag. As such, turning over our protections to machines is inevitable. Science and startups alike are delivering a welter of automation for protection, most not involving recondite algorithms, but rather big data fuel learning about what is normal, the better to identify that which is not, and thus suspect. I leave to any policy discussion the question of whether the speeds at which cybersecurity automation must run will even allow an occasional interruption to ask some human operator for permission to act. Or must cyber kill decisions be automated on the argument that only when so automated can they respond in time? If the latter holds, and I am certain that it will, science will be under the gun to encode human ethics into the algorithms that will thereafter free run. Put differently, I predict that it is in cybersecurity per se where the argument over artificial intelligence will find its foremost concretization. For frankly, I side with Hawking, Gates, and Musk in this matter. As an example of an unevaluable vignette, the self-driving car will have to eventually choose between killing its solo passenger or 15 people on the sidewalk. Many is the example of airplane pilots sacrificing themselves to avoid crash landing in populated zones. Coupled with algorithmic user identification, control thus enters a state where trust is multi-way, not one-to-one. It is hard to overestimate just how much the client has become the server's server. Take JavaScript, which is to say server-side demands that clients run programs as a condition of use, or web screens recursively assembled from unidentifiable third parties. The HTTP archive says that the average web page now makes out references to 16 different domains and makes 17 JavaScript requests per page. And the JavaScript byte count is already 5 times the HTML byte count. A lot of that JavaScript is about analytics, which is to say, surveillance of the user. But as a practical matter, any important control needs an override, such as for medical emergencies. Barring national security situations, such overrides should be thought of as closer to failure, a failure that must not be silent. I say that because to me the pinnacle goal of security engineering is no silent failure. And as such, the as yet unmet challenge is how to design security such that it never fails silently. There's scientific work to be done here. Full automation of cybersecurity maximizes the downside cost of falsely positive indicators of attack. Number 4, communications provenance. Provenance of network traffic will rise to new importance unrelated to quality of service or to transport neutrality. Delegation of credentials has heretofore been driven by executives, delegating their correspondence and the handling of it to their assistants. As devices proliferate, delegation of credentials and authority becomes a necessity across the board. At least it does for first world digerati. Take loading a web page in a browser. The browser does proxying, name service, lookup, et cetera, and eventually loads that page plus subsequent web page dependencies, probably from other sites. In other words, there are various levels of answer to the question of who actually requested what, such as what piece of JavaScript invoked Google Analytics. As a one-off experiment, I looked at the topmost page of CNN.com. There I found 612 hrefs across 38 hosts and 20 domains, even without evaluating the 31 JavaScripts found there. Competent scientists are studying the issue of how to characterize multidimensional attack surfaces, and as soon as they have results, we should attend to them. Because cybersecurity is to remain the driving reason for egress filtering, provenance, as in who ordered this page, is the crucial variable for intelligent flow control. If cyber integrity of the browser platform itself is to remain the topmost user goal, then agency, again as in who ordered this page, is likewise the most important variable for permission decisions. This need will be met with traffic analysis extending into the execution environment, which will come as no surprise to this sort of audience. What may be instructive, however, is that when the civilian public came to need encryption, within a decade the commercial sector caught up to the mill sector in the application of cryptography. Now, the marketeers are driving the commercial sector to catch up to the mill sector in traffic analysis. How the traffic analysis that marketeers demand, and will get, meshes with the traffic analysis on end users delegating human authority to their growing constellation of devices, that remains to be seen. But with dual demand for traffic analysis, the commercial sector will fill that demand one way or another. But even if the public and the marketeers want some kind of traffic analysis that is of a toy variety compared to what the mill sector needs, there are two other considerations in play. One consideration is that a non-negligible fraction of internet backbone traffic today cannot be identified as to protocol. It has no provenance and is likely peer-to-peer. While intentionally obscure traffic may as easily be pedophiles as heroic freedom fighters posting unexpurgated calls to arms, in a world where it is the machines that provide the cybersecurity by learning what is normal so as to tag that which is not, the pedophiles and the freedom fighters will stand equal chance of being blocked, if not outed. The other consideration is junk traffic, meaning traffic whose emitter is on some sort of autopilot but whose purpose is long defunct. Years ago, my colleagues spent a good deal of time trying to figure out what was calling one of our dial-up numbers. In the end, it turned out to be an oil tank in an abandoned building that was outfitted to request a fill when needed, and we had inherited the number to which such requests had once gone. Junk traffic will have to be dealt with via provenance or some discoverable correlate of provenance. Perhaps we will remanufacture spam detection for this purpose. Perhaps traceability will become the rule of law as soon as geolocation is applied to the internet as much as it has been applied to cell phone triangulation. Number 5, everything is unique. Science is fast teaching us that everything is unique if examined at close enough scale. Some of you already know this. Facial recognition is possible at 500 meters, iris recognition at 50, heartbeat recognition is possible at 5 meters. Your dog can identify you by smell, but so can an electronic dog nose. Your cell phone's accelerometer is plenty sensitive enough to identify you by gait analysis. A photograph can be matched to the camera from which it came, as well as a bullet can be matched to the barrel through which it passed. Some apartment building owners now require that tenants provide a DNA sample of their dog so that unscooped poop can be traced and fined. When everything is detectably unique, decision support of many sorts becomes possible. Assessing nuances, such as whether you are angry, will be embedded in automatons. Accountability will doubtless be extended to ever more minor behaviors. That heartbeat recognition technology is already slated to be in automobiles. Courtroom alibis will soon be backed by cybersecurity-like evidence, noting that because an alibi involves evidence of innocence rather than evidence of guilt, the privilege against self-incrimination is not implicated and is instead subject to compelled disclosure. The testimony of spouses against each other will be unnecessary. Their devices will do just fine. Number 6, opaqueness is forever. Where data science spreads, a massive increase in tailorability to conditions then follows. Even if Moore's law were to remain forever valid, there will never be enough computing. Hence, data-driven algorithms must favor efficiency above all else. Yet the more efficient the data algorithm, the less interrogatable it is. That is to say, the more optimized the algorithm is, the harder it is to know what it is really doing. The more desirable some particular automation is judged to be, the more data it will be given. The more data it is given, the more data utilization efficiency matters. The more data utilization efficiency matters, the more its algorithms will evolve to opaque operation. Above some threshold of dependence on such an algorithm in practice, there can be no going back. As such, if science wishes to be useful, preserving algorithm interrogatability, despite efficiency-seeking, self-driven evolution, is the research-grade problem now on the table. If science does not pick this up, then Larry Lessig's characterization of code as law will be fulfilled. So let me say why all this matters. What are its implications? There is no argument whatsoever that the proliferation of devices and information are empowering. It is categorically true, not to mention obvious, that technology is today far more democratically available than it was yesterday and less than it will be tomorrow. 3D printing, the whole maker community, do-it-yourself biology, micro-drones, search, home automation, constant contact with whom you wish to be in constant contact with. These are all examples of democratizing technology. This is perhaps our last fundamental trade-off before the singularity occurs. Do we, as a society, want the comfort and convenience of increasingly technologic, invisible digital integration enough to pay for those benefits with the liberties that must be given up to be protected from the downsides of that integration? If, as the great Peter Bernstein said, risk is that more things can happen than will, then what is the ratio of things that can now happen that are good to the ratio of things that can now happen that are bad? Is the good fraction growing faster than the bad fraction, or the other way around? Is there a threshold of interdependence beyond which either good or bad overwhelmingly dominate? Now that we need cybersecurity protections to the degree that we do, to whom does the responsibility devolve? If the worst laws are those that are unenforceable, what would we hope our lawmakers say about technologies that are not yet crucial, but very soon will be? Growth and personal power has meant that heretofore military needs, like traffic analysis, have become common needs. One then asks whether entities under attack, be they enterprises, carriers, or individuals, can garner enough provenance to engage in strike back, and if so, should they? As a righteous societal good, we, by law, require that persons with disabilities not be prevented from the fullest possible participation in our society. Can we find the wisdom to do something equivalent for those who cannot, or to the point will not, adopt the plethora of technologies that are redefining what full participation in society means? Is preserving such options for the non-participant the surest way to prevent a common mode digital failure? The need for what we have heretofore called cybersecurity is now so varied that it is no longer a single field, but many. There are perhaps 800, perhaps even 1,000 cybersecurity startups in some stage of the funding game. A fair fraction of them spin-outs from highly focused university research projects. Generalists, such as myself, cannot actually be replaced. There is too much now for the novitiate to learn. The core knowledge base has reached the point where new recruits can only hope to someday become competent, can no longer hope to someday become competent generalists. Serial specialization is the only broad option available to them. Cybersecurity is perhaps the most difficult intellectual profession on the planet. Ray Kurzweil is beyond all doubt correct. Within the career lifetime of everyone in this room, algorithms will be smarter than we are, and they will therefore be called upon to do what we cannot, to protect us from other algorithms and to ask no permission in so doing. Do we, like Ulysses, lash ourselves to the mast, or do we, as some would say, relax and enjoy the inevitable? What would we have science do? Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Those were pretty provocative thoughts that we're going to explore. But let's take a step back for a moment and talk about the business models and in the context of what the future that Dan describes could bring us. In Silicon Valley, we don't predict the future. We always say we build it. In my business, we find the builders and we give them lots of money and we pray we get it back. Now understand a few things. Cybersecurity is a huge business on both sides of the line. We've heard a lot about the bad guys today, right? And the need to protect us from the bad guys. The bad guys exist because there's a marketplace for them. Whether it's $1 trillion of IP and losses that happen on the internet every year, 100 going to $200 billion, the consumer losses, not to mention nation states playing for the ultimate game of military superiority, economic superiority. There's a lot of incentives on the bad guys out there to continue to operate in the bad kind of way. Equally so, the quote-unquote good guys, us money-grubbing venture capitalists, realize that there's a lot of money to be made. This last year, $2.4 billion was invested into 269 security startups. That's up from $1.8 billion in 258 companies in 2013. There were 78 security exits last year, 256 over the last 3 years. Global IT spending in cybersecurity reached $72 billion last year and is expected to reach $100 billion by 2018, which means it's growing about 9% if it goes linear. But it's not going linear, it's going faster. Most IT organizations are expecting their budgets to rise from 1/4 point of revenues. That's 0.25% of every dollar a company receives that applies to protect itself on the net, going to as much as 2% over the next 5 years. There are 14 billion devices on the net today. And most people expect that to go to 50 billion. Now, that's all really interesting. So we can see there's a lot of money to be made, whichever color your hat is, white, black, or gray. But the challenge we have here is the context of the net, not on how we protect the net today in the current uses. Most of the discussion today has been around protecting information on the net in classical terms, military and law enforcement. And the challenge of a military and law enforcement context, things like kill chains, perimeter defense, playing offense and defense, it immediately separates us from why we built the net in the first place. And if we play out the logical conclusion of the net, as Dan has pointed out, the net itself will eventually gain its own consciousness and intelligence to operate everything from what we should be buying next to controlling the most critical parts of infrastructure. In the 1970s, when we were growing up, most of us, some of you were not born, We moved atoms around. We physically took atoms, raw materials, put them on boats, ship them across the world, have a lot of low-cost, high-quality labor, put it all together into stuff, to put it back on boats and airplanes, to ship it over here to sell. We built an entire global economic infrastructure on supply chains. And that's the way we've been operating. Then somewhere along the 90s, some whiz kids from all around the world in many different countries decided that moving bits was just as important as moving atoms. And so we built out this infrastructure on an investment that DARPA or ARDA made around this thing called the internet. And we started moving bits around. We networked people together where knowledge and service becomes the driving force of economic gain on the net. In fact, we don't even measure it appropriately in these old metrics like GDP. But what does the future hold? If you're a country like China, and you ask yourself the question, what great product and service have you built in the last 100 years that was indigenous to your nation state? And realize that the supply chain, as the way we thought about moving atoms around, where low-cost labor was your value delivery, is about ready to change, where the drivers are going to be around IP, design, and robotic control of automated manufacturing systems, then you quickly realize that you better do something very quickly in order to maintain your relevance in the world. So it's no wonder why that country does what it does. If you need to jump the system and climb the ladder where IP becomes much more valuable than labor, because I can manufacture it at home by pressing a button, telling a robot to print it, construct it, and ship it, then I better go and do whatever I can to get that advantage. And that advantage is being able to borrow somebody else's designs on demand and put it out as goods and services, as most countries have done over the last 300 or 400 years. So let me tell you how the cyber world is going to go. When you walked the RSA floor last week in San Francisco, a couple things came to mind. One, the traffic was horrible. Right? Anybody who lived there, immediately everything took twice as long to get anywhere because all the people were at the RSA conference. Number two, while billions of dollars were being made, they were being made on evolutionary changes on the net in terms of security. There were very few new ideas on the show floor. Number three, that everybody was using the same traditional security, military, and defensive style words to describe protecting your mobile device, the cloud, your virtual machine, or quote unquote, an IoT device that nobody knows yet what that is, because nobody has an Apple Watch yet. So what are we doing? Well, new companies are being formed every day, taking the word big data, and we're going to mine the big data in cyber threat management. We're going to look for the threat. Followed with, we're going to predict where the threats are, and we're going to try to protect our networks and our systems where that threat is. We're going to shrink the perimeter down to where the data is, not to where the physical systems reside. Then we're going to add AI above those systems to make decisions for us, because humans in the loop are just too slow. It doesn't matter if you learn 3 days later why your networks got attacked and who stole the money, because the money already left the bank. And the issues that Dan talked about is just the reality of where the net's going to go in terms of cybersecurity, which means we will construct a world in which the economic underpinnings are machines talking to machines, where AI controls what information moves back and forth between endpoints, and those endpoints are not just our repositories of information, but control physical, kinetic kinds of things, whether it be your car, an airplane, or a gas valve on a gas line. If we think we have problems today, it's going to get much worse. And our current strategy that most nation states are using is by making it either a military or law enforcement problem. We need to change the term cybersecurity to cyber assurance, because security is the wrong framework. It brings to bear the wrong resources to fundamentally protect our net. The net, as designed, needs to be more about quality of service, commerce, and confidence of delivery, and safety and security. That doesn't mean that law enforcement doesn't have a role and the military intelligence does not have a role, but what it does say is you cannot depend on your organizations who are designed to protect a nation state to protect a global resource called the internet. And to make matters worse, you can't go to the guys who we pay as a nation state and other countries pay as nation states who go in and collect at the same time as to protect. So we've got a lot of work to go ahead of us. But the framework needs to be not about what the internet is today, but protecting the internet that we're going to rely on and our children are going to rely on in the future.
Okay, so now we're going to go into a bit of a conversation. Those were both very provocative thoughts, and we're going to try to unpack it. I'm going to start at the macro level here, based on your comments, Dan and Gilman, thinking about the internet of the future and the could-bes and the potential business models. Are we moving, you think, to an environment that's more stable? Is it an environment that is safer? Is it one, going to your point, Gilman, are we doing something, or could we do something on the offense-defense equation based on your thoughts with regards to the military law enforcement emphasis today?
Sure. Let me start off with the issue around law enforcement and the military. I think, again, we need to bring the other parties, commerce, state, FCC, to have an equal voice at the table. They have a voice, but not an equal voice at the table. We tend to think of these as in these old terms. The second thing we have to realize is when you kind of go through the equations of machines to machine communication and self-protecting information, that we need to have a better framework in which we decide who can look at the packet, how that packet needs to get protected, and who's in charge of guaranteeing it goes from point A to point B, which means wholesale changes in how we think about a regulatory front. We need to do all those things in order to go forth and be productive. I think the world fundamentally will be, on average, more safe. In other words, I think the AI routines, the deep data packet will make it harder for what I call the script bunnies and the low-level attackers. It'll take the noise out of the systems. And I think most countries will figure out that having that level of activity on the net for responsible behaviors is not prudent. On the other hand, I think there's also opportunity for more catastrophic failures. Because as we trust the systems more, as they add more nines of reliability, we're going to trust the systems to do more. And when it fails, it'll fail catastrophically. It's not that different than automated trading systems where on Wall Street. It's the reason why we banned a lot of that stuff, because they were so good. And remember, the hedge guys were making so much money. I mean, it was like printing money. They could just wake up and the little algorithm will do all their deep data mining the night before, and the quant guys would say, make that trade. But when they fail, they all fail together, and that's the danger.
So kind of building on that thought, this new framework, just thinking about it out loud and tying it back down to some of Dan's concepts. Dan led by talking about identity and where we're going with identity and the fact that, really device identity really eclipses user identity. what are the implications for privacy? You know, it was a hot topic in the last panel. It's been a topic this morning. Where do you think we're going?
You know, the word privacy has got so many potential meanings. I'm not dodging. I'll actually answer you in a second, but it has so many potential meanings, and of course has been modified over time really substantially. I am someone who grew up in a small town where we did know everybody, and of course the other side of that coin is they all knew us. But I understand that quite thoroughly. The scope, though, of who knew me or who I knew was limited to, in effect, walking distance. That's different than when you're talking about the whole world. However, we are troubled in the whole cybersecurity or cyber assurance, I like that term, by the way, the whole cybersecurity, cyber assurance, et cetera, world by the fact that if you ask a group of this size, you're going to get considerably more than one answer to a question like what is privacy, what is security, what is, you name it. What is a vulnerability? What is malware? You know, we'll get lots of different answers, which makes considered design of policy difficult because we're thinking of different things. Nevertheless, I will tell you my definition of privacy, which you won't like, and then we can go on from there. And my definition of privacy is you are in a state of privacy if you still have the effective capacity to misrepresent yourself. Now, the reason I say that is sort of like Eric Hughes' famous remark an awfully long time ago in the Cypherpunk Manifesto, which is the essence of free will is the ability to selectively reveal yourself to the world. In a world of censors, you don't have that. So the question is whether we want to retain that or whether we are perfectly comfortable walking away with it. And I believe that, by the way, is generational. And of course, I can talk as an old guy because that's what I am. I can't talk necessarily as someone who is not, but you know, I've got 4 daughters and 3 sons-in-laws and all of that. It seems to me that if indeed we are progressing in the direction I think we are headed, that is to say, worries about confidentiality are fading because of familiarity with day-to-day things like Facebook and you name it, then it may well be that the sea change going on now is not that we are losing confidentiality, rather we're giving it up. But if we do that, then the thing we have to think about most is integrity. In other words, if there's a mountain of data about me everywhere, I would prefer that it was correct. You know, if I can't control its collection, if I don't have this ability to selectively reveal myself, then I want it to be correct. Now, on the other hand, I would like to be able to selectively reveal myself, right. Hence the bit about my definition being the effective capacity to misrepresent myself, because that sort of crystallizes the idea. But the inflection point we're in, I think, is does confidentiality actually matter, or do we care about integrity? So, for example, if in the near-term future, medical devices are expanded to include your wristband, your toilet, you know, whatever.
Only in Japan.
Only in Japan.
The toilet part.
Well, yes, if it's expanded in a variety of ways, your refrigerator telling on you for what you eat, you know, whatever. If it's expanded in that direction, I guess I'd rather have it be correct than have it not be correct. And that's particularly true with medicine because everybody keeps predicting that all medicines will shortly be genomically targeted to the individual for whom they are intended. It'd be real nice if I'm taking medicine that was actually intended for me and not somebody else's by mistake. So we've got a, you know, we're on a river and we're coming to the ocean, but it's not one where the river runs into the ocean just like this. It's more like it fans out into 300 little, and we have to pick one.
You know, I think Scott Manilio was wrong. I think, I mean, Scott stood up, said the provocative thing that we all quote today, you know, privacy, get over it. And the reality is, human society has been built on both our public lives and our private lives, right? And it just happened that the internet made all of its money on our public side. It doesn't mean the public side isn't good. I'm happy to give away the information I give away to Amazon in order to get my discount and get the right product I want to buy one click away. I have no problem with that. What I do have a problem with is the underdevelopment of the net for me to put my trusted communications and information when I'm communicating with people in a trusted way and making that public and subject to all the vagaries of the internet. Look, if I post something on Facebook, I deserve what I get, right? That's just training.
But I should say that even if you have never yourself posted a picture of yourself with a tag on it, someone has.
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah.
I understand the nuances of where the net is going. On the other hand, the ability to communicate freely with trusted people and have that information be used the way it was intended to be used, it's critical. I mean, think about it. A lot of people have pointed out the problems with public governance. Is the fact that people are worried about the decisions they're making and how the world is going to perceive them on a day-to-day, hourly, minute-to-minute basis. If I'm sitting there in the Congress or in the White House and I'm taking an instant poll of whether this is a good idea or a bad idea, or as an investment banker or an analyst deciding whether I should dump the stock or go forward with the stock, has distorted both decision-making and our markets. And I would hate to see that happen to everybody on a day-to-day basis. So I believe that go forth on the public net, but we need to build out the private net as well and have that part of our lives preserved. And it's not the Europeans' right to be forgotten, but it's the right for the use of my information the way it was intended to be used. And that's the challenge.
It seems to me, both of you are, as you're talking, kind of redefining some principles here. And we used to think confidentiality, integrity, and availability were the hallmarks of information assurance. But as we think about cyber assurance, maybe as a concept, integrity becomes a key concept. This idea of ownership as perimeter, it really takes you to control. And the idea of yes, you own some things, but then you don't own some things. What do you think are the implications of that as you kind of go into the global business ecosystem?
Well, first of all, it's tied to ethics, right? And the problem is my ethics is different than your ethics. Clearly, the U.S. ethics are different than the Canadians and the Europeans and the Chinese, which is causing all sorts of problems. I mean, the big danger right now what we're facing is the balkanization of the internet, right? Now that we have all these rules made by judicial systems and legal systems and governments of old world people, legislating the way new world people, mainly those under 30, should be using the net. And they're going to distort it, right? I mean, this idea of, okay, let's say this. The Europeans want to have, European data stay, personally identifiable information staying inside Europe. Okay, are we going to look at every data packet and say which data packet has PII information and not? Oh, no, can't do that because we can't look into it, right? Oh, but the bad guys can look into it. Well, it's okay if it's a government and it's our government, but not your government. And if you're a multinational country, depending on country of origin, are you an American company or a multinational? If you're a multinational and you're complying with US laws in the US, but you're breaking that, by following the laws in the US, you're breaking European and Asian laws, what do? Do you have to follow everybody's rules?
Yes.
So the answer is yes, which means you're immediately in violation of somebody's rules somewhere else, right? Which could be crippling to the net. So, I think the old world models don't work. I think they're busted, and we got to fix it.
Well, you could argue, I think, that if we don't balkanize the net becomes government per se.
In its own stuff, yeah.
Yeah.
But you could also argue
down by treaties like the high seas.
Right. Well, that's where I was going. I mean, the international standards kinds of piece really comes into play here. I mean, how far can we drive to help us with international standards? What, in this new framework we're talking about, what does that mean for norms that we were talking about this morning? And so what's the sense with regards to how we need to change the way we think about policy development? Today we do it within a country.
Well, I go and get an x-ray. It's red in India. Should I care? Or should I care that I am able to discover that it was red in India? Or should I care that they didn't ask me first whether they, I mean,
what's the question?
There's a bunch of those.
Yep.
Take your question.
Yep.
But we're not that, we like to think of ourselves as modern, so much ahead of our forefathers in terms of our intellectual capacity to think about the world.
Go to any playground
Right.
Sorry.
I mean, whether it's the playground or the high seas, many, not all, many of these issues were tackled before, right? I mean, look, are we going to get countries to stop spying on each other? No. Are we going to get war fighters to stop using cyber military tactics to fight a war? No. Okay. For sane, rational players, does it make sense in normal times, not in times of war, to guarantee that financial transactions go through? Yes. Is it a good idea to keep everyday thieves off the net who steal our information and makes it cost a tax, which is a tax on society, makes your nation unproductive? Yes. So I think we could come up with those, but it's really hard if the principal players at the table are those who think about intelligence, military affairs, and traditional law enforcement in the way we think about it. I'm not saying they don't deserve a seat at the table, but the other players need an equal seat at the table, just like they did in the high seas, right? I mean, the US policy on cyber feels like many times, not always, because the State Department is very progressive on this, but take them out of the equation and commerce out of the equation. It feels like the way we're going to protect the net is by having the world's greatest Coast Guard. And we're going to have this super duper Coast Guard, and we're just going to protect the nation state in the physical regime, in this geospatial location, and, you know, be damned about everywhere else. That's not going to work. You need navies. There's navies for reasons.
So redefining roles as we kind of go forward in time. What's your sense, Gilman and Dan, as we think about not just cybersecurity companies, but critical infrastructure companies in the future? We talked about the global nature of all companies. What does it mean for the things that we really depend upon in terms of societal well-being, public safety? I'll tell you what, this autonomic control stuff, as a former policy guy, scares the bejesus out of me. I mean, it's how do you begin to work through that as you begin to figure out, escalation control and deterrence? Are those concepts relevant? How do they get redefined over time? So I guess the question I have is, one, what are the implications for the Chevrons and the Exxon Mobils and the Goldman Sachs of the world kind of moving into this space? And then secondly, when we think about investment areas, do the investment areas translate directly to what Dan just talked about, or are we in a path? How do we get out of evolutionary cybersecurity investment into something a bit different?
I think the money is kind of interesting. I had a meeting with a big company, multinational conglomerate that builds physical devices, and they said, don't come to us with any of these, more network security appliances. I need to protect the engines in the jets. I need to protect the X-rays coming out, the energy level coming out of the X-ray machines. I need to protect the control systems because it's kinetic. I think the real opportunity of investment as well as need and policy is where cyber meets kinetic. Because whenever you meet kinetic, it means things go boom. Computer algorithms have to decide who lives and who dies, right? When I need to listen to the human and when should I ignore the human. Don't forget, 3 Mile High took place because the humans started turning off the systems because they didn't believe what the machines were telling them, right? On the other hand, I'm not sure I like Airbuses computers can outvote the pilot versus Boeing where the pilot can outvote the machines, depending on who's flying this week. So I think there's some really new business models. I think there's a huge area. I mean, we're talking 50 billion devices. Yep. That's a lot more than firewalls that are out there, right? So if I can sell to the IoT systems, I'm going to make a lot more money than selling to the number of firewalls I can get out there. So I think there's huge opportunities. I will say the nation states have to start investing, though, in these new mathematical models and to look at these cascade problems. To actually, look, the net's a very complex system. It's very complex, but it's definable. But we need to spend the money to do so.
I'm sorry to say I disagree with that last bit because I think it's definable now, but I'm not sure that that's a permanent condition.
Could be, but now would be useful.
Now would be useful. The jury will disregard my comments. Do I think that there's a way out of this? Yeah. But if you look at the adoption curves, the classic, fast, it starts slow, it gets really fast, it slows down again. You look at the adoption curves, every business school draws those now on a regular basis.
Yeah, I got S curves and quad charts for everything.
And they're steeper and steeper, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when are they ever not steep?
Now we do compounded S curves, right? You do one of these.
Yeah. Well, anyway, the rate of adoption is very, very quick. That being said, do you want to continue that direction, or do you want some sort of gating factor? And I don't mean that you've got to get a license to sell. You can call it that if you like. But do we want to say, beginning at some point, just like we've said with cars, beginning at some point they have to get so many miles to gallon, beginning at some point, I don't know what to make of this exactly, but perhaps suggesting that in a near-term future, within the design lifetime of things that are being built, there are some downsides that if they appear at a later date, you are on the hook. As you all know, we have done nothing for liability regime with respect to cyber, probably because it's A, complex, and B, user error is, who said that on one of the panels earlier, user error is the dominant thing. But nevertheless, I've got friends in static analysis. They report that the programs that are being sent to them for static analysis work are growing ever larger. 2 gigabytes, 20,000 variables, and so forth. It's clear those are being written by machine. They have vulnerabilities. So we now have the situation where it isn't just humans that can write programs with vulnerabilities, so can machines.
But machines can do it at scale.
But they can write machines can do it at scale. Is that a place to hang a hook for future?
Set some goals, yeah.
Goals.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So we could go on for another hour. We've got time for a few questions from the audience, so if anyone has a question, please. Go, you have a microphone right here in the aisle. Yep.
Hi, I'm Samira Daniels, Ramsey Decisions. If in 30 seconds apiece, if each of you had one takeaway that you could broadcast to the world, what would it be?
Abandon this notion of cybersecurity and go to a model of cyber assurance.
Okay.
That's hard. I'll just give the classic caveat emptor.
Mike Nelson with Cloudflare. I'm also an adjunct faculty member here in the CCT program. Our company hasn't developed all that much new technology, but we've developed some great ways of putting together existing technologies and also a very interesting new freemium business model. And the problem is that some of the regulations that we see coming down, both here and in Europe, would completely eliminate some of the most exciting, innovative business models. One example that we saw a few months ago on the Hill, there was a hearing about how Facebook and Twitter were somehow enabling jihadists because they were providing their free service to wackos who thought they were jihadists. The implication was that somehow Facebook and Twitter should be filtering out all that and should be monitoring everything that's said by all their customers, which of course would destroy their business model. Can you give us some examples of stupid things government should not do that would get in the way of innovative business models in cybersecurity or in other cyber policy areas?
That list of stupidity is so long that I don't even know where to begin. I mean, here's the problem, right? There's a reason why governments are designed to move slow, right? Thank God they move slow, because if it didn't move slow, we would have a slew of really bad cybersecurity legislation approved and adopted. We're too focused on the near term. So there should be some acid tests on all new bad ideas, particularly as it proposed in legislation. If you wouldn't do it in the mail or on the telephone, you probably shouldn't do it on the net. So this idea that you should filter out all bad phone calls, right? The Stasis tried to do that. That didn't work very well for them. Okay, we shouldn't be following those kinds of models. I think the second thing that we need to think about in terms of bad rules is the internet is a global resource. It is not just a nation state's tool to do what it needs to do and protect its own companies. We need to protect a Japanese, a Russian, a Korean company as much as we need to protect our own. And until we have a set of rules that would equally be applied to any other nation state responsible player in the world, then by having bad rules that only apply to us allows other countries to adopt similar bad rules that will break down the net even further, right? So this parity is really important, right? Don't pass rules for yourself and your companies and behavior that you would not expect another country to apply exactly the same way.
Can we call that Louis' Law?
Good evening, my name is Olivier Burgstijk from Europol. First of all, thank you for the very interesting presentations and the very interesting discussion that followed. The question I would have, and particularly for Dan, I would say, is it about time that we start protecting the rights of a human being for his free decision as a human decision compared to being overridden by an algorithm?
I should give you the disclaimer that if I make $50 million by accident, I am moving to the 17th century with modern healthcare. So, so you're asking, in some sense, the wrong guy. Nevertheless, yes, I think that very much so. I sort of hinted at that earlier, which is probably what you're touching on. I think we need a space as much for a digital Amish as we do for a agricultural Amish. I truly think that we gain something that is hard. I haven't yet found the ability to express it well enough. But if we preserve the ability of people to live in a society without having to be wired, at any sense of the word, at any sense of the word, then we are preserving something that also gives us a protection against cascade failure that's universal. So, for example, in what year, I would ask you a sort of a thought question, in what year will compulsory car insurance be more expensive for the person who drives their own vehicle? At which point, everybody who is poor will submit to the monitoring. In what year will health insurance be more expensive if you don't wear Fitbits or something like it? In which case, there are people who will choose to pay more, and there are people who say, I have no choice, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many examples of that where, left to itself, the pricing strategy will quite naturally squeeze costs out of the system, but in the process squeeze out what I think you and I probably share, which is a kind of free will aspect that involves not being wired in. I think there's a book-length treatment in that. I don't know how to answer it here. You obviously touched a nerve. I don't know what else to say. But the ability to participate as a matter of choice, not as a matter of mandate or its economic equivalent, is, I think, crucial going forward. And I wish I knew how to express that well enough.
Well, I tried it in my house. It didn't work very well. I took away all my kids' iPads. That didn't work because then they sneak in my bag and they go and take my iPad. Well, so I got rid of all that. And then I got rid of all the electronic machines. But I will say something.
Make it possible for me to buy a cell phone jammer and we'll talk.
Well, you're not in this country. That's the FCC says you can't do that.
I know.
But on the other hand, I will tell you something profoundly happened. At least a week or so, I made my house as best I could digital free. Right? A new kind of thinking kind of took place. My kids were actually talking to me, or usually arguing with me, which is at least some form of conversation. I think the argument versus the sitting in front of the screen all day. There is something to the ability of choice, and that choice, hard to say how we're going to implement, but the ability to choose some level of voting to have this stuff assist me or not to assist me. It's sort of like being poor and living in an urban environment where all you're subject to is packaged good junk food, right? That only the rich can afford to buy the high quality food that they can have. Well, the same thing may happen in the digital world where the poor is not having the option to vote themselves off the island. It's kind of interesting. I went to Disney World and just recently with my kids, and they can't understand why I love this one ride in Disney World called, it used to be in Disneyland, but you moved to Disney World, called the Carousel of Progress. And, they go through, GE's progression from the light bulb into, VR helmets in the future. And, what was interesting? As a kid, I used to always love the future. I actually like about 1950 a little bit better in that ride now than, the year 2020. So, maybe I'm just getting old.
Let me say that we are talking about a problem of the whole cybersecurity thing. If you are young and you're starting out and you want to do something that matters, I would guess it's in biology, not here. Because the ability to screw things up there, I think, exceeds our ability to screw things up here.
I agree with that.
And so, if I may say so, we're here specializing in diseases of the rich.
So as we wrap this up, I've been jotting a few notes as kind of takeaways on the policy side that I just wanted to kind of lay out there. My sense is it is new models. It is about new models as we look into this world that Dan and Gilman have described, and it really, for the policymaker, there's a tendency too much to look back, although looking back is helpful, it's instructive. We can't divorce ourselves from what the future is going to bring. The other thing that I think I take away from this is we're moving into a world, not just because of the Internet of Things, industrialized Internet, but there is the potential for a lot more autonomic control, and we all need to think about that. There's lots of issues associated with that from a policymaker perspective. I'm not sure if I would disagree with Gilman or not on this, but I do believe the nation state has an important role in the space as we think about different nation-state relationships with private companies.
I agree with that.
Yeah, and we've got to take that into account as we go forward.
Remember, right now it's about $1 trillion, depending on who you want, what the value is to be a bad guy. When everything is controlled by computer systems, to be a bad guy or a disruptor, somebody who just wants to screw with you because they got nothing better to do with their lives. That's going to go up 2 or 3 orders of magnitude in the future, just because as we wire, it goes up end by end.
So I want to thank Gilman. I want to thank Dan for a very provocative conversation.